to We Create, the podcast that brings to light creative projects in our community. My name is Linda Salzer, and in today's episode we'll be talking about hard times on the farm, the good old days. I'd like to introduce my special guest, my mother, Barbara Kabrisky. Barbara Kabrisky was born in 1934. She lived on the Tug Hill Plateau in central New York, north of the Mohawk River, with her mother, father, and two brothers. The family home on the farm had no electricity, no running water, nor indoor plumbing. When she was 5 years old, they moved to a farm in Camden, New York. It had one 25-watt light bulb powered by a battery, no telephone, no indoor plumbing, a pot-bellied stove in the living room for heat, a cook stove, and oil lamps for light. Mom, when did the family move from the Tug Hill Plateau to Camden?
That was 1937. My father got up work, and we were able to buy a farm, which included the cows and everything, and still we had no running water or indoor plumbing, and not even a telephone or lights.
Oh, that sounds really primitive compared to what it's like today.
Yes, it was very primitive. Life was very, very hard. And but we made do, and not knowing any better, we were just as happy, I think, as we were when we had more advantages.
What's your memory of growing up with no electricity?
It seemed quite natural. You know, my mother took care of everything, and my brothers and father worked out on the farm, and we all sat around the table. My mother did all the cooking and the baking, and relatives were very close, her parents and her sisters, so it was really a family coming together and enjoying the holidays.
Well, did everybody go to sleep before it got dark, or did you carry lamps around with you, or how did
we went to bed early, 8:30 or 9. We had a radio that we listened to later when we got electricity, and we listened to all the old favorites, you know. And
do you remember any of the old favorites?
Let me see. I can't remember right now, but they came on every day in the afternoon, in the evening. Everybody would sit around the radio and listen to them.
Oh, that sounds really nice.
Yes, it was, sort of. There was a lot of static, and if there was rainstorms, you could hardly hear the...
When did the family home finally get electric lights?
I think just within in the 40s.
Well, what was it like to finally get light in your home? It must have been strange. Yeah.
Well, yes, it was very strange. But suddenly, it was like a miracle, you know. We turned on the lights and listened to the radio and sat around. You know, you could read the paper in the evening when the sun went down, and it was a whole different way of life.
Your whole life changed.
Yeah, we were considered that we were now living in a modern time. So, walking to school, no school buses came out. You had to walk to school. So that was
How far was that?
About a good mile. And the weathers were more severe. The snow was very deep, you know, up to the eaves. And when the snowplow came through, the snow was swept way high. It was a hard time. We didn't realize, not knowing any better, how hard it was and how fortunate we felt when life got better.
Well, did you have to wear snowshoes?
My brother did when we were up in Florence, but we had to wear high boots, and wool socks, a heavy coat, earmuffs or a knit cap that came down over our head. Mother made everything. She could knit and she could sew, and that was about it.
Tell me about raising animals. I think you told me once that she had chickens, baby chicks up in the attic. Is that right?
Yes. So you would make arrangements to Sears and Roebuck to bring out maybe 50 baby chickens. And she had a little burner there, and they ran around on newspapers, and she would feed them. And then as they grew bigger and got feathers, and the weather was warmer, they'd go out in the chicken house and live there. But that was kind of fun to play with them. Every once in a while, one of them would die. She'd get like 30 or 40 baby chickens, and it was fun to have them. They came in a great big kind of cardboard box. Yeah, we raised them for eggs and for eating. That was one of our meals.
Did you sell the eggs to the neighbors?
Sometimes. Sometimes they traded things for butter. Butter was made at home, and they might trade a dozen of eggs for a pound of butter. They used honey. We had bees that made honey, and
how did you keep the butter cold? You didn't have refrigerators.
Well, the woodshed, and that was very cold. There was no heating there. So we just had a sort of a box covered with a door, and we would put the butter in that. If you left it out, it might not be there in the morning because we had critters that could find it and carry it off. We had raccoons and mice and all that, and rats. They'd come into the woodshed and steal away our butter and the lard that we used.
Oh, that sounds like a real problem, having the critters come in and steal your food when it was so hard to make it.
They loved to get in. The squirrels and the chipmunks and the bats, they'd get into the attic, and then we'd have a problem. We had lots of cats, maybe 15 or 20 cats, and they kept the mice down in the barn. We had a collie dog that herded the cows and was sort of the guard dog. Everything, we made everything. We made it do, We had, in the springtime, the maples were tapped, and we had sap that became maple syrup, and that was the flavor of everything, really.
Now, you told me you didn't have any running water, so where did you get your water?
The pump. We had a pump. They put a pump in. It went down maybe 20 feet, and you lifted the handle, and when you pressed it down, the water came up and came out a spout. It was all spring water.
Whose job was it to go get the water?
Well, the pump was in the kitchen. By that time, we felt real modern. Most of the time, I have a picture of me standing next to the pump. It was out on the side of the hill. So usually my brother would have to bring that in big pails. But when they put a pump into the kitchen in the second farmhouse, we felt that we were living in the modern age.
Can you tell me about how the food was prepared?
Well, they did a lot of canning. And, everything was canned. My mother was an expert at it. You had to do it very carefully. And she had a pressure cooker. And you had to be very careful with this pressure cooker because sometimes if it got there's too much steam, it would just blow the tops. And then of course they had we killed a pig, and the big meat was sent to a butcher in town, and he would keep it in his butcher shop in the back, which was cold. A lot of times she pickled the meat. The bacon was cured. It hung up sometimes, and sometimes they had a smoke. I remember a smoke building where they would hang it in there. My grandfather was very good at that. They could smoke beef and pork and turkeys and that kind of thing. It was delicious tasting. But he knew that. They had to keep a fire going and the smoke going up. It was like a smoke shed. And out the top, and they knew how to hang usually done in the spring or fall. But the flesh was smoked, and it was very tasty.
That sounds delicious.
It was.
But I think food must have taken a long time to prepare back then.
It was. It was very hard work. The canning, and I remember my mother, you had to wash they were glass jars, and you had to cook the meat and or the chicken, whatever it was, and then put it in these glass containers, and then put them into a type of steamer. And they would steam it, the meat, and then they would have to put the lids on. So it was a delicate time. It was like a pressure cooker, only it was the food was being steamed in the jars. And as I said, the lids if you got too high, the lids were just thrown up in the air and it would go on the ceiling.
Did that ever happen?
Yes, a couple of times. The kitchen. And, because my mother would get busy doing something. She loved the garden. And to come in and there was an explosion. So it wasn't safe. It was dangerous.
It sounds very dangerous.
Yeah, I remember how the pigs were slaughtered. My grandfather would, with boards, corner this poor pig, and then, of course, it was nervous and it knew what was going to happen, and he would go in and slice the pig's throat, or they would run, and they did the same with chickens too, until they dropped. It was a very hard life.
Oh, what was the hardest part of living back then?
Just the temperature. It would get very cold and you get very isolated, and not phone. You know, everyone depended on the mail, and of course, when the roads were closed, you might not get a letter for 3 weeks. Then finally, we got a telephone. Somebody said, I think it was my grandfather said, we need a telephone. He said to my mother, we've got babies here. If they ever get sick, you're going to need a doctor. So they put up this line. It was 9 miles long with telephone poles. And one day, my brother, who was 4 years younger than me, he got very sick. He was a newborn, about 5 or 6 weeks old, and he began to cough, and he was running a fever, and they had to call the doctor, and he came out in his Model T Ford and along those back roads, and he came in and he said to my mother, make a cover and over the baby, let hot steam go in over him, and that's what cured him. He was my brother. Otherwise, he would have died. So many babies were lost in those times.
Yes.
The cold temperature.
Well, what was the best part about living back then?
It was the togetherness of the family, and it was so simple. We had the radio eventually. We could listen to Tom Mix or the problems of Dorothy Parker or whatever, you know. And we hung on to those segments every day. They'd come on about 5 o'clock. People would listen to them. And you heard the news, you know, the war, how the war was going. I heard the weather report and that kind of thing. It was interesting. But we were glad to have a radio. And we could sit around and listen to it. If you've seen some of these old pictures of these high radios, the family sitting around listening to the news of the war.
That was probably most of the connection you had to the world, you know, especially in the winter.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, of course, the telephone were party lines, 6 people to a line. You picked it up to make a call. All the other people were listening. So then we knew who was sick and who was coming for dinner and so on. There was no privacy.
Oh.
Yeah.
I don't know if I would have liked that. Well, if you could go back in time, would you?
Well, if I could go back in time, now that I'm 86, you think of all the good old days and the joys, you know. If I could go back, what would I do?
I don't know. What would you do?
Oh, I'd go back and talk to the people that are now long gone, like my grandparents. I wish I'd spent more time finding out what their life was like, you know, and how they got by and how they survived. I'd like to talk to them and my aunts and my uncles the neighbors, even my parents. You know, what were they thinking about? And the war, you know, that was quite shocking. That everybody was afraid the Japanese were going to invade, or the Germans were going to bomb us. And they had people who were always watching the stars and watching the moon and watching the skies just to see if foreign airplanes were coming.
Wow, that's a whole different world, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the best time was when the whole family gathered at Thanksgiving or Christmas. We had a big meal, and that was kind of fun. You saw your cousins and your grandparents and everything. So, you know, they talked about this and that and the news, and it was fun. Other than that, it was very hard, and parents were very worried and frightened, wondering where they're going to get their next dollar to pay the milk bill. And the milk went out in big tanks, you know, milk cans, and sent it down to the creamery. And then the farmers went on strike, and they were pouring milk out on the fields because they wanted more money for their milk. They finally got it, but that was very hard.
Can you talk a little bit about Roosevelt and the difference he made to poor people in the Depression?
Well, my grandfather hated him because they said he was a dictator and he had too much control. My parents liked him very much. They thought he had promise and that he was a good leader, but he took over making a lot of important decisions. Somebody had to do it, and he seemed to be the best man. But he raised taxes. That was one of the things that bothered the farmers. They could no longer get the price for milk. They couldn't pay taxes, so they just abandoned all acres, miles of acres of upstate New York and moved to town.
Part of the reason he did that was for programs such as Social Security. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. And that was a good thing because that's all that my parents had to live on when they retired. And everybody got something to survive on. Great changes in health care because there was somebody paying for it.
Well, Mom, it's been great having you on We Create and taking us back in time to really make us feel like we're there. We really appreciate everything you have to say, and thank you so much for being on here with me.
Thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed it, and if I can help you further, just give me a call.
Bye-bye. Thank you.